I was treated like the stupid one in my family for 30 years. My sister was making six figures. I was earning 42K as an assistant. That night, they stood in front of everyone and made it clear I would never be part of the company. Then a lawyer walked up to me and handed me an envelope. I opened it. 50.5% of the company. My name is Elena Marchetti. I'm 30 years old. For 2 decades my family had a quiet way of introducing me. A half-second pause before my name that said everything: this is the one who struggles. My sister Beatrice was always framed in the same breath as Stanford. As Kravith. As the future of everything our family owned. They didn't announce my reading disorder at parties. They simply arranged their lives so the subject never came up. They paid me a fraction of what they paid her. They sat me at tables far from the photographers. Then on the night Beatrice's promotion was celebrated at the Waldorf Astoria, in front of 300 guests who controlled half the commercial real estate in Manhattan, an attorney I had never met slid an envelope across my plate. What was inside undid every careful story my parents had ever told about me. What none of them realized was this: my grandmother had been paying close attention the whole time. She had taken notes. She had prepared. And what she left in a small mahogany box was enough to tip the entire family company on its axis. The Marchettis weren't new money. Our name was carved into hospital wings and museum donor walls. My father, Roland Marchetti, ran Marchetti Holdings, the commercial real estate company my grandmother Costanza had built out of a single Brooklyn storefront in 1965. By 2024 the firm carried a valuation north of $90 million. I was diagnosed at 7. The letters on a page would shuffle and reorder themselves. And a paragraph that took my classmates a minute would take me 4. My parents didn't respond with patience. They responded with embarrassment. By the time I was 12, my sister had a violin teacher from Juilliard, French immersion on weekends, and a Princeton-trained tutor who charged $400 an hour. When I asked whether I could see a specialist for my reading, my mother gave me the look she reserved for awkward expenses. We had already invested so much, she said. Some children simply weren't built for academics. I was 12. I believed her. So I built my own scaffolding. Audiobooks were my lifeline. I learned to convert paragraphs into diagrams and flowcharts, drawing what I could not easily read. And every Sunday I rode the train uptown to my grandmother's apartment on the Upper West Side, where she would sit with me for hours and explain ideas as stories instead of textbook chapters. She told me once, her hand resting over mine, that I read more slowly than most people but noticed what others walked past. That this was not a deficit. It was a different way of seeing. I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not for years. First I had to survive 19 more of being the family's quiet embarrassment. Christmas of 2018 stays with me. 20 relatives crowded around the dining table in my parents' Upper East Side townhouse. Crystal. Catered courses. The annual performance of Marchetti excellence. My father stood at the head and announced that Beatrice had been admitted to Stanford Law on full scholarship. Applause rolled around the room. My sister blushed with practiced modesty. Then his gaze drifted toward me at the far end of the table. And the warmth fell out of his voice. He simply said my name and stopped. As though that were the entire sentence. A few relatives laughed, the kind of soft, uncertain laugh people make when they don't know what else to do. Beatrice didn't say anything in my defense. She laughed along. Under the table, a thin hand found mine. When I looked up, my grandmother's eyes held something fierce. Something close to fury. But pointed at her own son. She didn't speak. Not then. 3 months later she called me uptown and said she had something to show me. I didn't know it that night. But a fuse had been lit. It would burn quietly for 5 years. I graduated from a state school in 2022. Never an Ivy. I asked my father for a position at Marchetti Holdings, hoping to prove I could contribute. He hired me as an administrative assistant at $42,000 a year. The same month, Beatrice came aboard as chief legal counsel at $280,000 plus bonuses. My job consisted of photocopies, conference room bookings, and coffee runs for executives who never bothered to learn my name. But I watched. I listened. While the executives talked deals in the hallway, I sketched the relationships between parties on scratch paper, mapping the flow of money and the places where interests would eventually collide. The strategy one had built to compensate for slow reading turned out to be useful in ways I had not expected. My grandmother had taught me this. On those Sunday afternoons she would spread out old contracts from the company's first decade and walk me through them. Not line by line but as architectures. My father read contracts looking for what could be exploited. She said I should read them looking for how the pieces held one another up. That same Sunday, just before her health began to slip in 2019, she pressed a small mahogany box into my hands. Brass hinges. Smooth corners. Keep it safe, she said. Don't open it yet. When the time came, I would know. I tucked the box into the back of my closet and tried to forget the strange weight of her words. She passed 18 months later. Pancreatic cancer. I was the only family member at her bedside in the hospice. The box stayed unopened. April of 2024. An email landed in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line, position restructuring. Confidential. My role was being eliminated effective July 1st. HR would be in touch about severance. I read it 3 times before the letters stopped swimming. That evening I stayed late, organizing files no one would look at. And through the wall I overheard my parents in my father's corner office. He was saying it would look bad to have me on staff once Beatrice took over. That people would ask questions. That some children simply did not have what it took. My mother answered softly that they had done everything they could. I pressed my palm against the wall. $42,000 a year. A studio in Queens shared with 2 roommates. No savings. If I lost the job I would be on a friend's couch within 2 months. But the money wasn't what tightened my chest. It was the realization settling into me like cold water. If I let them do this, if I accepted their version of who I was, I would spend the rest of my life as the family's failure. Not because I had failed. Because I had never been allowed to try. Beatrice's celebration at the Waldorf was the next evening. The grand ballroom held 300 guests. Investors. White shoe attorneys. Distant relatives I barely recognized. A 12-piece orchestra played quietly in the corner. This was my father's stage. The place where he performed his role as patriarch and king. I stood in the doorway tugging at the hem of a $79 dress from Zara. The most I could afford. My mother intercepted me before I could find my seat. Her gaze traveling from my drugstore makeup to my scuffed heels. She did not need to say anything. She placed me at table 27. Partially hidden behind a pillar. And reminded me that this was Beatrice's evening. And that whatever I felt I should keep to myself. I noticed him then. A silver-haired man in a charcoal suit. Standing alone near the entrance. He wasn't mingling. He wasn't eating. He was watching me. At 8:30 the lights dimmed and a spotlight found my father on stage with his glass raised. The applause began before he finished the sentence. Beatrice had graduated near the top of her Stanford law class. She had clerked for a federal judge. She had been put on partner track at Cravath in record time. He paused for effect. And then announced that effective immediately Beatrice would inherit the entire estate upon his passing. Including the Park Avenue residence valued at $13 million. And most importantly, the role of CEO of Marchetti Holdings when he retired. The room rose to its feet. Cameras flashed. My sister dabbed at her eyes with practiced grace. 300 people celebrated. And not one of them glanced at table 27. The cousin beside me, a woman I had met once at a funeral, leaned in and asked what that meant for me. I opened my mouth and closed it. What was there to say? I had just been formally erased in front of every person who mattered. The applause faded. And through the crowd the silver-haired man began walking toward me. He stopped at my table. Up close he was older than I'd thought, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. His name was Theodore Hayes, partner at Hayes and Brennan. He had been my grandmother's attorney. He produced a cream envelope from his jacket. Heavy stock, sealed with red wax bearing a notary stamp. It was her real will, he said quietly. The one my father did not know existed. The seal read September 12, 2019. 5 months after she had pressed the wooden box into my hands. He had been instructed to deliver the document on the day my father publicly disinherited me. He glanced toward the stage where my father and sister were still posing for photographs and said he believed that had just occurred. I couldn't breathe inside that ballroom. I pushed through the service entrance and found an empty hallway near the kitchen. Fluorescent lights buzzing. My fingers shook as I broke the wax. 3 pages of dense legal text. A notarized signature. The date she had signed it. She had revoked all previous testaments. And in the middle of the second page, the line that stopped my breath. To her granddaughter Elena and Marchetti she left a majority stake in Marchetti Holdings. More than half of the company's shares. Valued at roughly $47 million. Along with all voting rights attached. I read it twice. 3 times. Enough to control the company outright. She had written that the bequest was made in full knowledge of how her son had treated me. That I had been excluded and diminished and denied opportunity. Not because of any failure of mine but because of a failure of support. That the problem had never been my ability. The problem was that this child had never been raised. And she would not allow her son's prejudice to outlive her. There was a condition. To activate the bequest, I had to formally request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours. Miss the window and the document would be void. And the 2015 will would govern. 72 hours. The clock would expire at 8:30 on the 18th. I leaned against the cold wall. The document held to my chest. She had handed me a weapon. Now I had to decide whether I was brave enough to lift it. Theodore was waiting by the coat check when I came out. The clause wasn't a punishment, he said. It was permission. Permission to stop waiting for my family to change their minds. 3 days. If I wanted to proceed I would need to file a formal request. He could help me draft it. Through the open ballroom doors I could see my father still on stage. My mother circulating among guests as though she had earned every congratulation. If I did this I would burn every bridge I had. They would never forgive me. Beatrice would call it betrayal. But if I stayed silent I would accept their verdict. I would become exactly what they had said I was for 28 years. I told him I would call in the morning. He allowed himself a small smile. She said I would. He answered. That night in the apartment in Queens I finally opened the wooden box. Inside was a handwritten letter on my grandmother's stationery. A faded 1965 partnership agreement. And a small USB drive that had clearly been added much later. The letter explained what the partnership document was. The original founders' agreement. Never seen by my father. Establishing that the founders' shares carried permanent voting rights that could not be diluted without board approval. The drive contained something else. In 2018 my father had quietly proposed a resolution to reduce her voting rights from a controlling stake down to 10%. On the stated grounds that she was too old to understand modern business. The board had defeated the motion by 2 votes. Hers was one of them. She had never forgotten what he tried. She had never forgiven the way he treated me to justify it. As though diminishing me proved she was unfit. Use it wisely, she wrote. Not for revenge. for justice. The next morning I called Helena Whitford, the longtime board member my grandmother had built half of Brooklyn within the 70s. She answered on the second ring. She had been wondering when I would call. She had known about the will for 3 years. And she told me what I needed to hear. An emergency meeting required 3 board members to sign the petition. She was one. At least 4 others had quietly carried concerns about my father's leadership for years. They needed someone to go first. By the end of the call she had committed to filing the petition that night for a meeting at 10 the next morning at Marchetti Tower. My father found out at 4 in the afternoon. Beatrice called me 45 minutes later. Her voice tight. Demanding to know what I had done. I told her. Calmly. That maybe Helena had concerns about how the company was being run. She hung up without saying goodbye. 20 minutes later my father stormed past my cubicle on his way to his office. He didn't look at me. Through the wall I heard him on the phone. Dismissing the meeting as nothing. Calling Helena senile. Telling someone that I could barely read a spreadsheet and was no threat to anyone. I smiled. For the first time in my life. Being underestimated felt like an advantage. The morning of the meeting I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor in a borrowed gray blazer 2 sizes too large. Carrying a leather portfolio I had bought secondhand. The security guard told me I wasn't on the attendee list. Beatrice appeared behind me in a navy power suit and asked. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes. What I was doing there. I told her I had information for the board. She laughed and pointed out that I worked in the copy room. Helena stepped into the doorway behind her. 72 years old. Silver-haired. The kind of authority that could not be argued with. She had invited me. She said. I had standing. The boardroom was smaller than I had imagined. An oval walnut table. 12 leather chairs. Portraits of past executives on the walls. Including. Above the fireplace. My grandmother. Her painted eyes seemed to follow the room. The chairman. Walter Brennan. Called the session to order and gave Helena the floor. She yielded her time to me. My father raised his hand before I could begin. He stood. Buttoning his jacket with theatrical slowness. And explained to the room that I was his daughter and that he loved me but that I was not qualified to address them on any business matter. Beatrice added. With carefully measured sympathy. That I had a reading disorder and struggled with text. That some limitations could not be overcome with effort alone. A few board members shifted in their seats. Walter cut him off. I had requested the time. I was entitled to use it. I looked at the 2 of them across the polished table and felt something settle inside me. Cold and clear. They were not trying to protect me. They were not even trying to protect the company. They were trying to protect their version of the story. The one in which I was nothing. I told the room I would not be discussing my reading that morning. I would be discussing this. I lifted the will. The room went silent. I explained what it was. The last will and testament of Costanza Marchetti. Founder of the company. Notarized in September of 2019. My father said. In a strangled voice. That this was impossible. That her will had been executed in 2015. I told him. Evenly. That under New York estate law a subsequent valid will revokes all prior testaments. And that this one had been signed 4 years after the document he held. I slid it across the table to Walter. Theodore rose from his corner seat to authenticate it. He had been her personal attorney since 2008. The will had been executed in his presence. 2 independent notaries had witnessed it. The original was held in escrow at Chase Private Client. Walter studied the document. His eyebrows lifted when he reached the bequest. Beatrice said it was a forgery. But the certainty had drained from her voice. Theodore advised her. Very politely. Against making accusations of fraud without evidence. My father slammed his palm on the table. His mother had been ill. He said. She had been manipulated. I took out my phone. Perhaps he would like to explain this, I said. And pressed play. His own voice filled the room. 6 years younger. Telling the 2018 board that the founder was too old to understand modern business and moving to reduce her voting rights to 10%. The silence afterward was absolute. He sputtered that the recording had been made in private. I told him she had recorded it as was her right as a shareholder. Walter set down the will. His expression had hardened into something I had never seen pointed at my father. He asked me to read the relevant passage aloud for the record. I did. I read the part where she explained that the problem had never been my ability. That I had been abandoned. Not slow. I looked at my father as I read it. His hands, I noticed, had begun to tremble. Walter removed his reading glasses and asked Theodore to confirm the document was binding. Theodore confirmed it. The 2015 will was superseded. As of that moment, I was the majority shareholder of Marchetti Holdings. For the first time in my life I watched my father look at me with something other than dismissal. It was fear. Beatrice tried once more. Brittle now. Saying that even if the will held I had no business experience and could not run a company. I told her. And the rest of the room. That I was not asking to run the company. I was asking the board to examine the facts. I produced the 2018 minutes. I confirmed with Helena that the resolution had failed by 2 votes. One of them my grandmother's. I asked whether anyone had documentation contradicting what had been presented. Nobody did. The board recessed for 15 minutes. The recess stretched to 45 while their counsel conferred with my grandmother's firm and the state records office. When they returned, Walter read out the verification. The will was valid. The 2015 testament was revoked. As of that morning, I held the controlling stake. He asked whether I had any motions to bring forward. I stood. My heart was pounding but my voice held. I told them I was not proposing to remove my father. The room shifted. Beatrice's head snapped up. Even Helena looked surprised. What I was proposing was a vote of confidence. The board would decide whether he retained their confidence as CEO. If the majority voted no confidence, he would resign. If the majority voted confidence, I would not interfere with operations during my tenure as majority shareholder. Beatrice rose to call it a spectacle. I told her, evenly, that this was the same governance procedure my grandmother had written into our bylaws 40 years earlier. If our father had the board's confidence, he had nothing to fear. Walter looked at me for a long moment. Something close to respect moved across his face. Helena seconded the motion without hesitation. 4 hands rose for confidence. 7 rose against. Walter counted twice. Set down his pen. And turned to my father. The board had voted no confidence. Per the bylaws, he had 30 days to tender his resignation. My father said nothing. He stood and looked at me. Really looked. For what may have been the first time in my life, I had expected rage. What I saw was worse. Recognition. The understanding that he had underestimated me so completely that he had lost everything. He walked out without a word. He cornered me in the corridor outside. My mother already with him. Her makeup smeared with tears. He called me ungrateful and scheming. I told him my grandmother had written that will 5 months after he tried to strip her of power. Because she had finally seen who he was. That he had not lost because I had betrayed him. He had lost because he had betrayed her. My mother stepped forward and tried to tell me they had only been protecting me. That I had always struggled. I told her she had not protected me. She had erased me. 28 years of silence finally pressed into words. Every dinner. Every photograph. Every conversation in which she spoke of Beatrice and pretended I did not exist. That had not been protection. That had been abandonment. My father grabbed my arm and told me they would contest the will. I pulled free. He would lose, I said. And he knew it. Because my grandmother had planned for every contingency. I walked to the elevator. Behind me I heard my mother call my name. For the first time in my life. I did not need her permission to leave. The doors closed. 42 floors down I leaned against the brushed steel wall and let myself breathe. The adrenaline left. And what came after wasn't triumph. It was grief. I had just severed 28 years of hoping that if I were patient enough, quiet enough, useful enough, my parents would finally see me. That hope was dead. I had killed it myself. My father signed his resignation the next afternoon. Effective in 30 days. Walter was appointed interim CEO while the search for a permanent leader began. The board offered me a formal seat as strategic advisor while I figured out my long-term relationship with the company. A week later the trade press picked up the story. The heir apparent had been displaced by a previously unknown family member. Sources close to the board described the transition as long overdue. My parents cancelled their appearance at the Met Gala for unspecified health reasons. 3 investment partners requested meetings with me directly. Not with my father. 2 of them, after long conversations, confirmed they would continue with the company. One of them admitted, gently, that they had carried concerns about my father for years. Helena called me Saturday morning. She said Costanza would have handled it the same way. The vote of confidence instead of an outright firing. She had always said that mercy was the ultimate power move. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Mercy was not weakness. Mercy was choice. And for the first time, the choice had been mine. 3 weeks after the meeting, my mother asked to meet at a coffee shop in Midtown. She looked older. The careful makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion underneath. She apologized for everything she had said. For everything she had failed to say. I asked whether she was apologizing because she was sorry or because everything had changed. She admitted both. Ashamed. She said she had told herself for years that they had been protecting me from expectations I could not meet. That had been a story she invented so she would not have to feel guilty. I told her I could not pretend the past 20 years hadn't happened. But I was willing to try building something honest. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a beginning. 2 months later Beatrice called while I was walking through the park. We sat on a bench near the fountain. She had been in therapy 3 times a week since the meeting. She told me, without rehearsal, that being the golden child was a different kind of cage. That every grade had been a baseline. Never an achievement. That when she watched our parents treat me the way they did, she had told herself it was just how things were. Because if she defended me she would have become a target too. She did not offer it as an excuse. She offered it as the truth. I told her I could not go back to the way things had been. But I was not interested in being enemies either. Maybe we could begin from scratch. Her eyes filled. She said she would like that. By November I had moved into a 1-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights with a view of the bridge my grandmother used to walk across to her first office in 1965. My new salary as Director of Sustainable Development at Marchetti Holdings, a division I had pitched and built, was $185,000 a year. Plus dividends from my shares. The work focused on green building. Environmental impact. The kind of patient innovation my grandmother would have championed if she had lived to see it. My father called once a month. Short. Polite. We discussed the weather. The apartment. The work. We both pretended the past had not happened. It was easier that way. My mother and I had lunch every other week. Slowly. Awkwardly. She was learning to see me as a person rather than a problem. Beatrice and I got coffee on weekends sometimes. We were learning each other for the first time. Neither of us pretended the past was acceptable. But we were writing something new. On the wall of the new apartment I hung my grandmother's portrait. The same one that had watched the boardroom for 40 years. Sometimes when the evening light hit it I could almost see her smiling. I understand something now I could not have understood at 28. She had not left me her company because I was better than my sister. She had left it to me because she trusted that I would not let power do to me what it had done to my father. The reading disorder was never my flaw. It was simply part of how I saw. Alongside the visual memory. The patience. The noticing. The same things that had made me look slow in my parents' eyes were the things that let me see the truth when everyone else looked away. My father had measured worth by credentials. My grandmother had measured worth by the way a person treated those who could not fight back. And now, finally, I get to measure my own.